So how bizarre is it that a free, English-speaking African landowner wound up in the court case that helped legitimize slavery for life? Now, Anthony Johnson is a remarkable story because he emerges so clearly from the records that we have that we can actually reconstruct his story. Historians love that kind of thing. But he was not alone. There were dozens of other free African landowners. And if they were free and owned 50 acres, they could vote. And the courts often sided with those other free African landowners, just like they sided with Johnson. Some of those other free African landowners married English women. So by mid-century, by 1650-ish, this place had still not developed something we would recognize as race, or developed racial slavery. Neither one.
So the 70-year rule was gone way back once he went to court. Once they went to court, it's not a rule that you can only own a slave for 7 years.
No, remember, so that is a contract,
The contract.
right? The indentured servitude. But if they're not a Christian, you can own them as a slave.
But he was a Christian.
Casor? Casor converted. And so that was the loophole that the courts... And really, all the courts were doing there is rigging the system in favor of the landowners the same way they always did. So a landowner came and said, hey, this guy's trying to get away from my control. And the courts say, well, we're not going to let that happen. Let's find a way to protect the landowner and the people owner. Really, they're not just landowners, right? They're people owners. It is such a better term than master, don't you think? People owners. I might use that from now on. So, the population keeps growing. And what had started with this little fort called Jamestown, by 1650, the English now lived all up and down this river. All these lands you see in like this darker red color. Some had moved out here to the eastern shore, which is what the Mine Owned Ground book focuses on. So they're spreading, always needing more land to cultivate tobacco. So we're going to come back to Virginia in just a little while. But leaving it here around 1650, it's a pretty ambiguous beginning, right? There's no signs yet that this place will, 50 years later, be completely committed to racial slavery, which I just ruined, because it will be. But you couldn't see that at the moment. So that settlement was down here along the Chesapeake Bay. Up here to the north, the Dutch settled on a little island that the local Indians called Manhattan. And the Dutch settled on this little island and creatively called their settlement New Amsterdam. Where had they left from? Amsterdam. And then created New Amsterdam on what is today the island of Manhattan. The same, well, a similar kind of ambiguity characterized the early period of New Amsterdam. Here in New Amsterdam, there were Africans from the very beginning. So the first Dutch settlers in 1624, they brought a few Africans with them. Because remember, by the 1600s, who was becoming the dominant slave traders? Not anymore. The Dutch. Remember, the Dutch were pushing the Portuguese out now, getting into the slave trade. Slaves in New Amsterdam helped defend the colony. They were expected to have weapons and be ready to help defend the colony from attack. This this is a picture of a Dutch plantation right outside Manhattan Island. And so the Dutch used slaves from the beginning. But who did they say could be a slave? Non-Christians. So here too, they started out with a religious kind of slavery. And unlike down in Virginia, they had this weird thing here that they called half-freedom. The picture here is just of a slave auction on this street that the Dutch called Wall Street. And that's the same Wall Street you hear about today in New York City.
And this is in Manhattan.
Right. And so this was the center of kind of the slave market in New Amsterdam. Same place where all the stock trading goes on today. And actually they called it Wall Street because they built a wall, afraid that the English would come attack them. So it was literally a wall all along the street. All right, so this thing called half-freedom that the Dutch had here. The way this worked, slaves were allowed to live separately from their master. So they could live independently. They could work for themselves. But legally, their master still owned them. Living free and supporting themselves, those Africans were expected then to pay a tax to their master. So from the master's perspective, this is different from something we might normally think of as slavery. Because you're really letting your slaves go live somewhere else, do their own things, as long as they pay you every month. So enslaved people who got half freedom felt pretty free. But not completely free, right? Because that guy still legally owns you. Others got complete freedom. And the Dutch society was set up so that there were not so many obstacles that a free African couldn't become successful. And some of them did. Some free Africans in New Amsterdam owned land, and they owned servants. So here too, the system was not yet rigged in favor of something we would call white people. There were still opportunities available even though slavery existed. If you were free in New Amsterdam, you had access to the courts. So you're supposed to have the same rights in the Dutch courts that a Dutch person did. And we know from their court records that the courts often sided with Africans. If they converted to the Dutch religion, a branch of Protestantism, then they went to the same churches with Dutch people and worshipped right alongside them in this Dutch Protestant Christianity. But the number of Africans here too was small. By the 1660s, there were 9,000 Dutch people in New Amsterdam and 700 Africans. So I don't really do math, but I think that's like, what, 8% of the population? Something like that?
9,000 Dutch, 700 Africans?
Yeah. So a small part of the overall society. But those that were here, like we've seen, had all these ways that they had rights, protections, and some opportunity. But this Dutch society was swept away in 1664 when the English captured New Amsterdam. So Wall Street didn't do its purpose. You know, it was supposed to keep out the English, and it turned out it didn't work. They knocked Wall Street down and took over. once the English took over this Dutch colony, slavery grew more quickly. And that period of half freedom disappeared. So we've got the first English colony, right? The first Dutch colony. And in the same period, other Englishmen had their sights on the Caribbean. In 1627, a group of Englishmen settled here on the island of Barbados. 1627. Barbados was one of the smaller Caribbean islands. Still is. One of the ones that is a little closer to the South American mainland. And when these Englishmen settled here in 1627, what was the newest way to get rich that the English had heard of? Tobacco. Right. They came here intending to grow tobacco. And who did they bring with them from England to actually do the work?
The Africans.
Indentured servants. So you can't get Africans from England, right? They bring indentured servants from England. And they tried to grow tobacco, but it was disastrous. It turned out the climate here wasn't right to grow good tobacco. And when they tried to sell it back in England, nobody would buy it. Because what could they get instead?
More premium tobacco?
From where? From Virginia, right. So if you could get the delicious stuff from Virginia, you would never buy this Barbadian crap. So the original idea for this place failed. But in 1642, an Englishman here in Barbados traveled down to Brazil, where at that point the Dutch were controlling Brazil. Remember, they had stolen it from the Portuguese for a while? And he went down there to study those machines that the Dutch were using in sugar production. Remember the machines you need to squeeze the cane, boil the syrup? So this Englishman goes down to Brazil, studies the sugar machinery, and brought all that knowledge back to Barbados, and actually improved on the designs that the Dutch were using. So he made the sugar machines more efficient. And that meant that growing sugar was suddenly more profitable than ever before. And now, the guy who first did this made such a profit off his first crop of tobacco, the next year he bought dozens of indentured servants from 1 year's profits. And what did other people with enough money to get into the sugar game? They bought up the island as quickly as they could to try to grow sugar. But to grow it, you need workers, right? You need lots of workers. So back in England, kidnappers just started abducting poor people. Just kidnapping poor people from the streets of English cities and then bringing them to Barbados to sell them. And when the servant gets off the boat and says, "Wait, I didn't sign this contract willingly, I was abducted," what does your master say?
Yeah.
Shut up, get to work.